She thought her job was answering phones and hiding in the back office. She had no idea she was already a target. Maren Ellis had spent 6 years perfecting the art of being unremarkable. Soft-spoken, sensible cardigans. A body she folded into the smallest version of itself every time she walked through a room of thin, sharp-edged women. She worked as personal assistant to Damon Voss, the most feared man in the city, and in 2 years she had never once let herself imagine he saw her as anything but furniture that filed his paperwork. Tonight, that was about to change, because someone out there had already decided she was worth killing. Damon Voss did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. Men who ran empires the size of his rarely needed volume, they needed only stillness, and the promise coiled beneath it. He was broad-shadowed, dark-eyed, dressed always in black like a man who had made peace with being feared. His office sat 40 floors above the city, glass and steel and absolute silence, and from behind that desk he controlled shipping routes, real estate, and the quiet fear of every rival family from here to the coast. Maren had learned his coffee order, his silences, his rare and devastating half-smiles. She had not learned, until tonight, that loving him from a careful distance was the least dangerous thing about her life. 9 o'clock found her locking up the office, her arms full of ledgers, her low heels echoing on marble long gone quiet. The building had emptied hours ago. She didn't notice the black van idling across the street. She didn't notice the 2 men peel off the sidewalk and fall into step behind her, patient as wolves. A hand closed over her mouth before she even registered the footsteps. The ledgers hit the ground. Papers scattered like startled birds. A second man seized her wrist, wrenching her arm behind her back hard enough to make her cry out against the glove smothering her scream. Her heart slammed so violently she felt it in her teeth. This isn't real, some frantic corner of her mind insisted. This cannot be real. Voss's girl, the first man muttered to the other, dragging her toward the curb. Voss wants her breathing. Barely. Maren thrashed. She was not delicate, and in that single desperate moment her size, the size she had spent years apologizing for, became the only thing standing between her and the van door. She drove her elbow back into ribs with everything she had. The man grunted, stumbled. It bought her half a second. Not enough. The van door slid open. Rough hands closed around her ankles. Then the night exploded. She thought no one was coming. She had no idea Damon Voss had known about the threat for 6 hours, and had been waiting, silent and armed, for exactly this mistake. He came out of the dark like something the city itself had exhaled. No warning. No shout. Just the sudden, brutal certainty of a man who had already decided these 3 men were already dead, and was simply taking his time collecting on it. The first attacker didn't see the fist that broke his jaw. The second turned just in time to catch Damon's forearm crushing into his throat, folding him backward into the side of the van with a sound like a dropped sack of stone. Maren, released for 1 stunned second, stumbled toward the wall, and that was when the gunfire started. White light split the street as the muzzle flashed. Damon moved before the sound had even finished registering in her brain. He crossed the distance between them in a single stride, wrapped one arm around her, and threw the full weight of his body over hers as they hit the pavement together, his shoulder taking the impact of the concrete so her spine never touched it. A bullet tore through the brick above their heads. Concrete dust rained down like snow. "Stay down," he growled against her hair, his voice a low, dangerous vibration she felt more than heard. His body was a wall over hers, solid and immovable, his heartbeat hammering against her back almost as hard as her own. "I have you." Maren couldn't breathe, not from fear or not only from fear, from the impossible fact of Damon Voss, the man half the city crossed streets to avoid, covering her with his own body like she was something worth more than his life. More gunfire answered his return shots. One arm braced against the pavement, the other extending a pistol she hadn't even known he was carrying, firing with a precision that spoke of a man who had done this before and would do it again without losing an hour of sleep. The third attacker went down and stayed down. Then silence. Real silence. The kind that follows violence like a held breath. Damon rolled off her only enough to look at her face, his hands framing her jaw with a gentleness that felt almost impossible against what his hands had just done. "Look at me," he said. "Are you hit?" "No," she gasped. "No, I don't think so." His thumb brushed a streak of dust from her cheek, and something in his dark eyes cracked open. Something that looked less like relief and more like fury barely restrained. "They came for you," he said, "to get to me. And I let it happen. You didn't." "I knew," he cut in, low and hard. "I knew there was a threat tonight. I should have told you. I should have pulled you off this building an hour ago. His jaw ticked, the muscle flexing beneath skin gone tight with rage. He was aiming entirely at himself. That will never happen again. Sirens wailed somewhere blocks away, and still he didn't move, didn't let go, as if the moment he did, the last 20 minutes would become real in a way neither of them could survive. Mr. Voss. Damon, he said. After tonight, you don't get to call me that anymore. He finally rose, pulling her up with him as though she weighed nothing at all. One arm still banded around her waist like he expected the pavement itself to try and take her. The street around them was chaos now. Flashing lights, shattered glass glittering under the street lamps. 3 men either unconscious or worse sprawled across the asphalt he had claimed as easily as he claimed everything else in the city. None of it seemed to touch him. His attention had narrowed to a single point, and that point was the woman trembling against his side. Can you walk? He asked. I think so, Marin whispered, though her legs didn't feel entirely like her own. He didn't test the theory. He simply lifted her, one arm beneath her knees, the other cradling her back, and carried her to the black car idling at the curb, a car she hadn't even noticed arrive, driven by a man in a dark suit who asked no questions and offered no reaction to the blood on his employer's knuckles. Marin pressed her face into the solid warmth of Damon's shoulder and let herself, for the first time in 6 years, stop being strong. You don't have to hold yourself together right now, Damon murmured against her hair as the car pulled away, leaving flashing lights and shattered glass behind them. Not with me. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to matter to someone who has never let anyone matter to them, stay with me, because Marin Ellis was about to find out exactly how far Damon Voss would go, and exactly how much of his empire he was willing to burn to keep her alive. They didn't go to the hospital. Damon's own physician met them instead, in a private room 3 floors above his penthouse, and Marin sat rigid on a leather exam table while a quiet man checked her pulse and pronounced her, miraculously, unharmed. Bruised. Shaken. Alive. Damon stood the entire time in the corner of the room like a sentry carved from stone, arms crossed, eyes never leaving her. He hadn't spoken since the street. He didn't need to. The silence coming off him was its own kind of language, cold, coiled, promising violence to whoever had ordered this. She's fine, the doctor said finally. Rest. No stairs tonight, Mr. Voss. If you're insisting she stay. She's staying, Damon said. Before Marin could even open her mouth, she should have argued. The old Marin would have apologized her way out of the room, insisted she could go home, insisted she didn't want to be a burden. The word she had used about herself for so long it had worn a groove in her mind. But tonight had cracked something open in her, and what came out instead was simply the truth. I don't want to be alone right now, she admitted, quiet, raw. I keep seeing the van door. Something shifted across Damon's face. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt in front of her, bringing himself deliberately to her eye level. The same way, she would learn later, he only ever did for people he refused to let feel small in front of him. You will never be alone with that memory again, he said. Not tonight. Not ever. He didn't leave the room after that. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed she eventually settled into, and he sat there through the small hours of the night. Not hovering, not smothering, just present, a solid, silent fact in the dark. Every time Marin startled awake from some fractured half-dream of the van door sliding open, she found him exactly where he'd been, watching her with the patient, unblinking focus of a man standing guard over the only thing in his life he had ever been afraid to lose. Around 2 a.m., she finally asked the question that had been circling her mind since the pavement. How did you know? About tonight? Damon's jaw tightened. An informant inside Castellano's organization flagged unusual movement 3 days ago. I doubled security on the building. His voice dropped, rough with something that sounded almost like realization. I should have doubled it around you specifically, and I didn't because I convinced myself distance would keep you safer than my attention would. I was wrong. Distance is what let them get close enough to try. She thought the danger had ended in that alley. She had no idea the men who attacked her were only the opening move, and that the man giving the order was someone standing far closer to Damon than either of them realized. Lorenzo Marsh had worked as Damon's head of security for 9 years. He had access to the building's cameras, the guard rotations, and, Damon would discover before dawn, a very quiet, very lucrative arrangement with the Castellano family, who had spent the last 18 months trying to break into Voss territory through the one door Damon had never bothered to lock, the woman he trusted enough to leave alone in his own office at night. Damon found the wire transfer at 3 a.m., sitting in his study while Marin slept 2 floors above in the guest suite he had personally chosen, the one with the reinforced windows, though he hadn't told her that. His jaw tightened as the numbers scrolled across the screen. $50,000, routed through 3 shell accounts, landing in Lorenzo's name 4 days before the ambush. Silence settled over the study as he picked up his phone. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist against the desk. His voice, when it came, was quieter than Maren had ever heard it, which was precisely how she would come to understand, in the weeks that followed, that Damon Voss was never more dangerous than when he sounded calm. "Bring me Lorenzo," he said. "Now. And bring me everyone who touched that building's security feed tonight." By morning, Lorenzo Marsh was gone. Not dead, Damon would tell her later, watching her face carefully for the flinch he half expected and didn't get. Just gone. Erased from every ledger, every account, every door he'd ever had a key to. Deported to a version of his life with none of the money and all of the fear he had tried to sell to someone else. "You didn't kill him," Maren said. When Damon told her over coffee she hadn't touched. "No," Damon said. "Killing him would have been a mercy. I want him spending the rest of his life waiting to see if I change my mind." She should have been horrified. Instead, something in her chest loosened, the particular relief of a woman who had spent years being told her fear was an inconvenience, finally sitting across from a man who treated her fear as a debt to be collected. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Out of everyone in that building, why did they want me?" Damon set down his cup. His eyes, when they met hers, held none of the coldness the rest of the world knew him by. "Because everyone in the city who wants to hurt me has finally figured out what I already knew the day you walked into my office and corrected a $300,000 accounting error without blinking." His voice dropped, rough at the edges. "You're not my assistant, Maren. You haven't been for a long time. You're the only person I've ever let close enough to become a weakness, and I will burn down every family in this city before I let that weakness become a wound." Maren's breath caught. "Damon, I've spent years making sure no one could get close enough to use against me," he said. "I built walls so tall I forgot what it felt like to want someone on the other side of them." He reached across the table, his hand closing over hers. Not possessive yet, not demanding, just steady, grounding, real. "You're already on the other side, Maren. You have been for months. I was simply too much of a coward to say it before someone put a gun near you and made the choice for me." She stood then, rounding the table until he stood behind her chair, and pressed a kiss to the crown of her head with a reverence that felt entirely out of place on a man who had erased another man's entire existence before breakfast. "For 6 years I told myself I kept you close because you were the best assistant I'd ever had," he said quietly. "That was never the truth. I kept you close because the day you stopped being in this building would be the day I finally admitted how empty it already was." Warmth spread through Maren's chest as she turned in her chair to look up at him, her heart hammering for an entirely different reason than it had 2 nights ago. "I used to rehearse conversations with you in my head," she admitted, cheeks warming. "Ones I never had the courage to actually start." "Start one now," Damon said, crouching until they were level again, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "I promise you, whatever it is, I already want the answer to be yes. If you've ever needed someone to tell you that you were never too much, you were simply waiting for someone brave enough to want all of you, keep listening because Damon Voss was about to prove it in front of the entire city." The Castellano family made one more move. It would be their last. 2 nights later, Damon received the call he had been waiting for, a formal meeting requested at neutral ground, the kind of invitation that in his world was either a genuine peace offering or an elaborate excuse to get him somewhere his own men couldn't follow. He accepted anyway, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he brought someone with him he had no intention of losing. "You don't have to come," he told Maren, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror while she stood behind him in a dress his tailor had sent over that morning. Deep emerald, cut to skim her curves rather than hide them. The first thing she had worn in years that didn't apologize for her body before she even walked into a room. "I'm not staying behind again," Maren said. "Not while you walk into a room full of people who tried to have me taken." Something in his chest ached at that. Not fear for himself, but the specific, devastating tenderness of being defended by someone he had spent his whole life defending instead. "You've changed," he said quietly. "You did that," she said. "You looked at me like I was worth protecting, and I finally started believing it." Gold light spilled across white tablecloths in a private dining room at the top of a hotel Damon owned through 4 different shell companies, a fact the Castellanos did not know and would come to regret. Vincent Castellano sat at the head of the table, silver-haired, smug, flanked by the same tailored menace as every man who had ever underestimated exactly how far Damon Voss would go for something he called his. "Voss," Vincent said, spreading his hands in mock welcome. "And you brought your—" His eyes flicked over Maren with open, insulting appraisal. "Assistant. How sentimental." Cold settled over the table faster than the air conditioning could explain. Damon didn't raise his voice. He never did. "Careful, Vincent," he said, pulling out Marin's chair himself before taking his own beside her. A gesture so deliberately intimate the entire table felt the shift in power before a single threat had been spoken. The last man who spoke about her like that is currently explaining to a federal prosecutor exactly how deep his ties to your family go. Vincent's smile faltered by a fraction, the first crack in 9 years of careful composure. "That was Lorenzo's arrangement, not mine." "Lorenzo's arrangement was your money," Damon said, "which means Lorenzo's failure is now your problem. You sent 3 men after a woman who has never held a weapon in her life to send a message to me." He leaned forward, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. "Let me send one back. Touch anything of mine again, her, my people, my territory, and I will not send men to your door. I will come myself, and I will make certain the last thing you understand, before it's over, is precisely how badly you misjudged what she means to me." Vincent thought he still held the leverage in that room. He had no idea Damon had spent the last 36 hours quietly buying every debt Vincent owed across 3 states, and was about to collect on all of them at once. "You have 90 seconds to decide," Damon said, sliding a folder across the table. "Bank records, shipping manifests, evidence of a decade of Castellano crimes that would keep federal investigators busy for years. Either you disappear from this city tonight, taking every one of your people with you, or that folder finds its way to exactly the desks that will end you by morning." Vincent stared at the folder like it might bite him. His men shifted uneasily behind him, sensing, correctly, that the balance of power in the room had already collapsed entirely in Damon's favor. "You're bluffing," Vincent said, though the tremor in his voice said otherwise. "Ask Lorenzo," Damon said. "Oh, you can't. He's currently somewhere you'll never find him, wondering the same thing you're about to." Nothing moved in the room for a long moment. Then Vincent Castellano, the man who had ordered Marin's kidnapping 4 nights earlier, stood on legs that were not quite steady, and walked out without another word. His men followed. By dawn, the entire family would be gone from the city. Not dead, not disappeared in any way that would draw police attention. Simply erased from every territory Damon Voss had ever claimed as his own. Tailored suits filed out in silence, leaving nothing behind but the low hum of the city 40 floors down, entirely unaware of how much power had just changed hands in a single conversation. Marin let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 4 days. "That's it? He just left? That's how real power works," Damon said, watching the door close behind the last of them. "It doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be final." He turned to her, and the cold mask he wore for men like Vincent dissolved into something warmer, rawer, entirely hers. "You're safe now, Marin. Not because I got lucky, because I made certain of it." She looked up at him, at the man who had thrown his own body between her and gunfire without a second's hesitation, who had erased a decade-long rival family in 72 hours because they had dared touch her, who was looking at her now like she was the only unguarded thing left in his entire carefully armored life. "I used to think being invisible kept me safe," she said quietly. "I spent years making myself smaller so no one would notice me, hurt me, want anything from me. And now?" Damon asked, his hand rising to cup her jaw with the same gentleness he'd shown her on the pavement that first terrible night. "Now I know the only thing that ever kept me safe," Marin said, "was you noticing me anyway." He drew her close then, slow and certain, the gesture of a man who had already decided this woman was worth rebuilding his entire empire around, and intended to spend the rest of his life proving it. "You were never invisible," he murmured against her hair. "I saw you the very first day. I was simply waiting for the world to try and take you from me, so I'd have a reason to show it exactly what happens to anyone who tries." City lights spread beneath them in a glittering, indifferent grid an hour later as they stood together at the window of his penthouse, entirely unaware of the 2 people rewriting the terms of an empire above it. Marin rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, unhurried rhythm of his heart. A heart that had, for nights ago, thrown itself over hers without a single moment of hesitation. "What happens now?" she asked. Damon pressed his lips to her hair. "Now," he said, "I stopped pretending I ever wanted an empire more than I wanted this." His arms tightened around her, solid and certain. "Now the whole city learns exactly what it costs to come near what's mine, and you learn exactly how far I intend to go to make sure you never doubt it again." She thought her story ended in survival. She had no idea it was only just beginning, because Damon Voss didn't do anything by half measures, and the ring already waiting in his desk drawer upstairs was proof of exactly how far this was going to go. What happens when the most feared man in the city stops protecting his empire and starts protecting a family instead? If you want to see exactly how far Damon Voss goes to make Marin his forever, drop shielded in the comments, and I'll bring you part 2 of their story next.